And I think it's
Right.
important to remember, I mean, I just can't repeat enough. These stories about him being engaged in treasure digging, these all come from the Philastus Hurlbut affidavits. Hurlbut was not an objective reporter. He wasn't the guy from The Economist. He was looking for dirt, and he was quite open about it. And then Hurlbut got into trouble, and he passed them on to this guy, E.D.B. Howe, and then he put them in his book, which is the first anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled.
These are
Yeah.
all very, very questionable, whether or not these are even legitimate statements from these actual people, because we don't have any way of verifying these people actually said these things. There's a big difference between telling a folk story and actually practicing it, which is the charge that's made in Mormonism Unveiled, is that Joseph and his family are out practicing witchcraft, right? This leg injury might have actually been God's way of building Joseph Smith's vocabulary. Because had he not had this leg injury, he would have been working almost all of the time. All right, welcome to Latter-day Saint Ideas. I'm Andrew Knaupp. I am glad to be joined today by my friend Jim Lucas, who I've had on the channel before and has been willing to come back and share some more information with us. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Most recently, he has co-authored with Jonathan Neville, By Means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation to the Restoration, which is this book, which you can all get at Digital Legend or Amazon. And it's a great book. Loved reading it. And it's part of why Jim is here today to talk about some of the great info they have in their book about young Joseph Smith, which I found fascinating, goes contrary to sometimes the narrative we hear about Joseph Smith. So part of the narrative that you're talking about is that he's out treasure digging. Let me ask you this question. So the modern view has been pushed now in church history that Joseph Smith, somehow he has free time to be out looking for treasure with the local treasure hunters, right? Not the treasure digging he was paid for by Josiah Stoll, which he openly talks about, but somehow he's out doing all these other things. In your reading, in your study, do you get the impression that the Smith men had free time to be doing activities like that?
I would not think so. I mean, as you correctly point out, they were having financial difficulties. They were kind of scraping by. So, like the work that he did for Josiah Stoll, that's not unusual because they did hire out to work on other people's farms. That's how they became so well acquainted with Martin Harris, because he had hired them to work on his farm. They had a big operation. They did the maple sugar. Yeah,
Yeah.
they would go out and tap the trees, which is really difficult because you got to like boil it down, boil it down, boil it down,
Right.
down. So that's a lot of work.
Tons of
But
work.
anything to make some money. Joseph Sr. would like make furniture, and so they had all kinds of projects that they would do to raise money. So unless he was paid to do it, like with Josiah Stoll, it is hard to see how he would have tons of time to go stomping through the wilderness with Willard Chase. And I think it's
Right.
important to remember, I mean, I just can't repeat enough. These stories about him being engaged in treasure digging, these all come from the Philastus Hurlbut affidavits. There was this apostate member of the church, doctor, though he wasn't a doctor, his
Right.
name was
First name
actually
doctor.
Doctor,
Yeah.
had gone up to Palmyra and went around to all the neighbors. Most of the people in Palmyra neighborhood had not been receptive to the restored gospel. Hurlbut was not an objective reporter. He wasn't the guy from The Economist or whatever,
Right.
trying to get just the facts, man. No, I mean, he was looking for dirt, and he was quite open about it. So he went all over, and a lot of people wouldn't talk to him. But he did find some people who said, "Oh yeah, we'll tell you about those Smiths. You know, we'll dish some dirt." And that's what the Hurlbut affidavits are. They were solicited to be negative, and then Hurlbut got into trouble, and he passed them on to this guy E.D.B. Howe, and then he put them in his book, which is the first anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled. I think you need to take all that stuff with a grain of salt. So,
I
so
would
this,
say more than a grain, because we don't have any of the original documents. We
right.
don't know if Philastus Hurlbut made up these affidavits. We don't have anything
Whether
signed by these people who he says gave him these statements. So when we
That's
talk
right.
about affidavits, sometimes you're a lawyer, sometimes you think, oh, that's sworn. You better swear to this. These are just written statements he claims he got from people.
That's right. They weren't, it wasn't like they went down to the judge and had him notarize it or anything, which is what you think of as an affidavit in our modern times. It's something that's been sworn to before a public official. And they had that procedure. Swearing something before a notary public is a very old procedure. And there were certainly people in Palmyra that if he had wanted to do that, there would be judges and notaries in Palmyra, but he didn't do it. None of that was done with any of those. He could have elaborated,
He
and
could
who
have
knows?
edited these statements if he did interview these people. We
Right.
don't know if he was literally writing down word for word as they're speaking or if he wrote down notes. These are
Yeah.
all very, very questionable, whether or not these are even legitimate statements from these actual people, because we don't have any
Mhm.
way of verifying these people actually said these things.
Right. But I mean, I think we do need to keep in mind that this folk magic stuff, it was in the culture. So that's why I
Right. Here's
say
the
that
question:
we.
is I haven't read anywhere, and if I've missed something, let me know. Lucy
Mhm.
Mack Smith doesn't mention it ever. She
No,
doesn't mention them doing any of the things that people talk. And I agree with you that it was in American culture, but we don't have any actual historical evidence from anybody in the Smith family that they were participating in any of these folk magics.
no, we just have the Hurlbut affidavit saying that the Smiths were involved with this stuff.
Right.
So
Right.
that's what you got,
That's
and
what
that's
that's what it
and
is.
and it's been 200 years, so that's all we're ever going to have. I mean,
Yeah.
there's always a chance that something will peer out of an attic, but people have been researching Mormon history for a long, long time. But this is not an area that nobody's ever looked into, shall we say?
Correct. Correct.
So
Unless we get another Mark Hoffman to make up some new ones.
that's right.
We've
That's right.
as Boyd K. Packer said, we've sifted around in the dust of history for a long time, trying to find something on Joseph Smith. So, summarize here the view of Joseph Smith that you have presented from the historical stuff you've researched is he has a leg injury. He's convalescing for at least a year with his uncle in Massachusetts,
Mhm.
which would have had plenty of books.
Uncle Jesse would have had a lot of books. Uncle Jesse's neighbors would have had a lot of books. I
And
mean,
you'd
this
borrow
is
books from your neighbors, right?
that's right.
Might not have been a formal library, but hey, I'll loan you my book. You loan me your book. People took care of them. They valued them. They were expensive,
That's right.
to buy
That's
books.
right.
So the possibility of Joseph in that year reading not only his Uncle Jesse's collection of books, but Uncle Jesse borrowing, hey, neighbor, can I borrow one of these books from my convalescing nephew who's
Mhm. That
got a
would
leg
be
problem, very
that would be
believable, right?
that would be entirely consistent with the culture. Some people may be saying Salem, Salem. Wait a minute, Salem, Massachusetts, and but this was 150 years after the Salem witch trials,
Sure.
so we should give the good folks of Salem, Massachusetts, a break here. This is way later, but that's how they got into trouble with their witch trials. Was not because they were ignorant and superstitious. It's because they knew their Bibles so well and were so entrenched in following the Bible very, very strictly. That was what got themselves into trouble with their witch trials. That's what led them
Yeah, yeah.
to
And
get all crazy about that. And I would note in their defense, that's what ended the witch trials, was that some men from Boston came and basically said, now, wait a minute, you're not following the correct Bible procedures in these trials. So we gotta shut these down because you're not doing because the Old Testament, you got to have a certain amount of witnesses for stuff. And that was one of the reasons that the thing was able to be shut down so readily.
a side note, maybe you knew this already, but King James actually wrote and commissioned the first book on the occult.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had this book he'd written about witches.
Right.
And so you have the King James Bible, and then you have the King James book on the occult and witchcraft that they're using as their
Right.
way of determining who's a witch or not.
That's right. So it was very much a part of the English culture that they brought over with. They
Right.
brought the King James Bible and they brought King James's Malador, whatever it's called, the book
Right.
on
He's doing
witchcraft.
everybody a favor trying to help
And,
identify the witches, right?
we pointed out in the book, it's not like we've so far distanced from that. Well, if you think that we don't believe in witches and wizards and stuff like that anymore, we still love them. You ever heard
Yeah.
of Harry Potter?
Yeah. Exactly.
So I wouldn't criticize the Smiths and their neighbors if they still retain some of those old folk legends and
Yeah. And
superstitions
I think there's
because,
a big
hey, we do
difference.
today.
Yeah, there's a big difference between telling a folk story, a ghost story or whatever, or fairies, and
Mhm.
actually practicing it, which is the charge that's made in Mormonism Unveiled, is that Joseph and his family are out practicing witchcraft, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
doesn't seem like they A, have time for that, B, ever write or talk or make any references in their writings about ever
right,
doing anything like that. In fact,
right.
they were very much the opposite. Lucy Mack Smith's own discussions about her own near-death experience, where she makes a
Mhm.
covenant with God to save her life.
Mhm.
Her family was very much on the straight and narrow, as far as she knew, the best she knew about what the straight and narrow was. She was making sure her family was doing it, and
Right.
nightly prayers and scriptures. So they
No,
were
and
very strict.
we have a quote in there from a sermon that she gave in Nauvoo, where she's telling people how to raise kids. And she said, you read them their Bible, you get them reading their Bible just as soon as you can, and you spend your time reading the Bible to them. And this is borne out. The fact is that Joseph's family, not only his parents and his siblings, but his extended family, other than Jesse, all come into the church and are very devoted to the church, and they lead very exemplary lives. The brothers, Samuel and Don Carlos and Hiram, and the sisters and the cousins, George A. and the other Johns. The Smith family is very dedicated and they lead very exemplary lives. They wouldn't have that consistency if that's not how they were raised.
Yeah.
That a lot of that goes back and speaks to how the extended Smith family were raised, their attitude towards religion, their faith, and their belief. So
Yeah, and that quote you have from Lucy Mack Smith, she specifically says by the time they're 4, I believe,
yeah,
that you should be teaching them the Bible and teaching them to read from it so that
right.
they'll like it. And then
Mm-hmm.
she specifically says, and I was as devout as any at doing
Right.
that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it seems like the evidence is that the only reason he was even able to read these many books was because of this leg injury. Because in a farming family where you're trying to survive, literally, the Smiths had lost everything. It's everybody works, all
Mm-hmm.
hands on deck. This leg injury might have actually been God's way of building Joseph Smith's vocabulary. Because had he not had this leg injury, he would have been working almost all of the time.
Well, I think that what follows from the facts, from the historical record, bad things have a purpose, and this leg surgery was really, really horrible. But weak things become strong in the face of adversity. There was just a very long period of time when you're absolutely right. If he hadn't had that leg injury, his ability to uh, to do this much reading and to do this much studying and to do this much contemplating would have been very, very limited.
It seems like that's what Lucy Mack Smith, she says he was the least inclined to the perusal of books, right? You guys go into the definition of that, which,
Mm-hmm.
it's not what most people think it is, but this idea
Right.
that Joseph was a deep thinker, very, very deep thinking, and not just sort of reading books and getting ready and going on to the next one. And it lines up with his own description about pondering before the first vision and
Mm-hmm.
considering all of these things he's heard and read and really thinking about the meaning of all of it and having that desire to resolve this question.
Right.
So
Lucy,
also,
I point out in her biography, she also says, although he was less given to the perusal of books, but he thought more. But then she continues, so everybody stops there. But she then goes on to say, but he was much more given to deep thought and meditation. And
right.
she says he was much more interested in religious questions than other boys of his age.